Good day, Ma'am Claudine. My name is Femi Oromaguera from BED 1E. This is the report of the grade Group 1 in your subject Reading in the Philippines History, entitled The Introduction of History Definition, Issues, Sources, and Methodology. This chapter, there are learning objectives. Number one, to understand the meaning of history as an academic discipline and to be familiar with the underlying philosophy and methodology of the discipline. Number two, to apply the knowledge in historical methodology and philosophy in assessing and analyzing existing historical narratives. Number three, to examine and assess critically the value of historical evidences and sources. Number four, to appreciate the importance of history in the social and national life of the Philippines. This chapter introduces history as a discipline and as a narrative. It presents the definition of the history, which transcends the common definition of history as the study of the past. This chapter also discusses several issues in history that consequently opens up for the theoretical aspects of the discipline. The distinction between primary and secondary sources is also historical methodology employed by the historian. Ultimately, this chapter also tackles the task of the historian as the arbiter of facts and evidences and making his interpretation and forming historical narrative. The definition and subject matter of the history has always been known as the study of the past. Students of general education often dread the subject of its notoriety and requiring them to memorize dates, places, names, and events from distant eras. This low appreciation of the discipline may be rooted from the shallow understanding of history's relevance to their lives and to their respective contexts. While the popular definition of history as the study of the past is not wrong, it does not give justice to the complexity of the subject and its importance to human civilization. History was derived from the Greek word historia, which means knowledge acquired through inquiry or investigation. History as a discipline exists for around 2,400 years and is as old as mathematics and philosophy. This term was then adapted to classical Latin where it acquired a new definition. Historia became now known as the account of the past of the person or of a group of people through writing documents and historical evidences. That meaning stuck until the early parts of the 20th century. History became an important academic discipline. It became the historian's duty to write about the lives of important individuals like monarchs, heroes, saints, and nobilities. History was also focused on writing about wars, revolutions, and other important breakthroughs. In simple terms, historiography is the history of the history. History and historiography should not be confused with each other. The former subject of the study is the past and the events that happened in the past and the causes of such events. Thus, historiography lets the students have a better understanding of history. They do not only get to learn historical facts, but they are also provided with the understanding of the facts and the historian's context. The methods employed by the historian and the history and perspective which guided him will also be analyzed. Historiography is important for someone who studies history because it teaches the students to be critical in the lessons of history presented to him. Positivism is the school of thought that emerged between the 18th and 19th century. This thought requires empirical and observable evidence before and can claim that a particular knowledge is true. Positivism also entails an object means of arriving at a conclusion. in the discipline of history, the mantra no document, no history stems from this very same truth, where historians were required to show written primary documents in order to write a particular historical narrative. Positivist historians are also expected to be objective and impartial, no, not just in their arguments but also in their conduct of historical research. Postcolonialism is a school of thought that emerged in the early 20th century and formerly colonized nations grappled with the idea of creating their identities and understanding their societies against the shadows of their colonial past. Postcolonial history looks at two things in writing history. First is to tell the history of their nation that will highlight their identify free from that of colonial discourse and knowledge. And second is to criticize the methods, effects, and idea of colonialism. Post-colonial history is therefore a reaction and an alternative to the colonial history that colonial powers created and to their subjects. Next, we will tackle about the history and the historian. Historical research requires rigor despite the fact that historians cannot ascertain absolute objectivity. The study of history remains scientific because of the rigor of research and methodology that historians employ. Historical methodology comprises certain techniques and rules that historians follow in order to properly utilize sources and historical evidence. In writing history, certain rules apply in cases of conflicting accounts and different sources, and on how to properly treat eyewitness accounts and oral sources, a valid historical evidence. In doing so, historical claims done by historians and the arguments that they forward in their historical writings, while may be influenced by the historian's inclinations, can still be validated by using reliable evidences and employing correct and meticulous historical methodology. There are two sources of history. Number one, primary sources. Number two, secondary sources. Primary sources are those sources produced by the at the same time as the event, period, or subject being studied. For example, if a historian wishes to study the Commonwealth Constitution Convention of 1935, his primary sources can include the minutes of convention, newspaper, clippings, Philippine Commission reports of the U.S. Commissioners' records of the convention, the draft of the Constitution, and even photographs of the event. And the second sources is secondary sources, are those sources which were produced by an author who used primary sources to produce the material. In the other words, secondary sources are historical sources which studied a certain historical subject. For example, on the subject of the Philippine Revolution of 1896, students can read Teodoro Agoncillo's Revoli of the Moses, the story of Bonifacio and the Katipunan, published originally in 1956. The Philippines revolutions happened in the last years of the 19th century, while Agoncillo published his work in 1956, which makes the Revoli of the Moses a secondary source. Then, there are two types of criticism. Number one, external criticism. Number two, internal criticism. External criticism is the practice of verifying the authenticity of evidence by examining its physical characteristics, consistency with the historical characteristic of the time when it was produced, and the materials used for the evidence. For example, of the things that will be examined when Conducting external criticism as document include the quality of the paper, the type of the length or ink, and the language and words used in the material, among others. Second criticism is internal criticism. On the other hand, in the examination of the truthfulness of the evidence, it looks at the content of the source and examines the circumstance of its production. Internal criticism looks at the truthfulness and factuality of the evidence by looking at the author of the source, its context and agenda behind its creation, the knowledge which informed it, and its intended purpose, among others. For example, Japanese reports on the declaration during the period of the war should not be taken as a historical fact. Hostility about this topic is Philippine historiography underwent several changes since the pre-colonial period until the present. Ancient Filipinos narrated their history through communal songs and epics that they passed orally from a generation to another. When the Spaniards came, their chronicles, perspective of historical writing and injury also shifts. The Spanish colonizers narrated the history of the colony and the separated view they saw the age before colonization as a dark period in the history of the islands. That's all about this topic. Thank you and God bless.